They said I'd never belong here. But the first time I heard it in words that left no room for misunderstanding, it came from my own son-in-law's mouth. She married into us, not up. But your mother, she's just lower-class trash. He said it like a joke, his voice dropping into that lazy drawl of condescension men use when they think cruelty is wit. I was standing in the hallway between the dining room and the kitchen, holding a bowl of roasted potatoes, hearing the clinking of wine glasses and the faint hum of their laughter. They didn't see me at first. Maybe that's the point. I'd learned how to be invisible in that house long before that night. I'm 74 now, and I live alone above a laundromat that smells perpetually of detergent and heat. But back then, I lived with them, my daughter, her husband Jason, and their baby girl Mia. I'd moved in to help while they both worked those long, ambitious hours that people mistake for meaning. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few months, until the nanny search was over, until the mortgage stabilized, until everything settled down. But nothing ever really settles in a house where love is rationed like money, and courtesy is a form of currency. Jason came from a family that framed their wealth as taste, that made manners sound like morality. They didn't yell, they dismissed. They didn't insult directly, they corrected pronunciation. He was always careful with his tone, but never with his intent. When I arrived, I could tell my presence made the air shift in subtle ways. The dinner napkins became linen instead of paper, the silverware more polished, the music softer, as though I were an uninvited echo from a place they'd outgrown. My daughter Elise called me Mom in private, but Mary, when guests came over. I told myself it was habit, that she didn't mean anything by it, but each time she said it, something inside me folded smaller, like laundry tucked out of sight. That night, the one with the roasted potatoes and the sentence that would never leave me, they were hosting one of Jason's work dinners. He was about to become partner at his firm, and the house gleamed with effort. The kitchen smelled of garlic and something expensive, the kind of food you can't pronounce without apology. I had done most of the cooking, though Elise had told everyone Jason had hired a caterer. "It's just easier that way," she'd said. I didn't mind, not at first. Mothers get used to being erased in the name of smoothness. We are the invisible labor behind other people's reputations. But when I heard that word, trash, slip from his mouth so easily, I felt something ancient move inside me. A pulse, quiet but steady. The sound of self-respect waking after a long hibernation. He didn't know I was listening. He was speaking to one of his colleagues, a man with a voice like polished marble. They were talking about background, about where everyone came from, as though it were a game of pedigree. My name surfaced like a footnote, a small embarrassment in an otherwise tidy narrative. Jason laughed and said, "Elise's mother means well, but she's from a different world. Lower-class roots, you know. Sweet woman, but no filter, no refinement. Then, softer, almost kindly, trash, really, if you think about it." That's when his friend laughed, and I understood that it wasn't just a passing cruelty. It was entertainment. I didn't confront him. I didn't throw the potatoes. I just placed the bowl on the table, careful not to make a sound, and went upstairs to the small room at the end of the hallway, the one they called the guest suite, though it was really a converted attic, too hot in the summer, too cold in the winter. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They were steady. I thought about all the hands those same fingers had held over the years. Elise's fevered ones when she was small, my husband's when he was dying, even Jason's once, when he first joined the family and wanted to make a good impression. I'd fed them all, mended their clothes, given them comfort. but to him, none of that mattered. In his world, love wasn't currency. Lineage was. The next morning, I made coffee early, before anyone else was awake. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant thrum of the baby monitor. I stood by the window watching the light climb over the manicured hedges, and I thought about the women in my old neighborhood, the ones who worked double shifts and still found time to bake for their families, who sewed Halloween costumes out of leftover fabric, who laughed too loudly and cried in bathrooms at night. Were they trash too? If so, then I was proud to be made of the same material, durable, unpretentious, and impossible to destroy. Elise came down eventually, bleary-eyed and apologetic in the half-hearted way of someone who doesn't know what they're apologizing for. She asked if I could pick Mia up from daycare later because Jason had a client dinner. I said yes, of course. That was my role, to say yes, always yes. But inside, I was already saying something else. I didn't know what I would do yet, only that the word trash had lodged itself somewhere deeper than anger. It had settled into clarity. Throughout the day, I caught Jason looking at me differently, polite but wary, like a man who senses he's been overheard. He didn't mention the conversation, and neither did I. We went on performing civility, but it felt brittle, rehearsed. Every time he said please or thank you, it sounded like punctuation for guilt. I moved through the house like a ghost who knew where every secret was buried. The photos on the walls told a story I wasn't in. Elise in her wedding gown, Jason in his tailored suit, baby Mia on her first trip to the vineyard, but nowhere the woman who had sewn Elise's dress, paid for the first college semester, or watched that, baby when no one else could. I'd been erased with grace, which is the most polite form of cruelty there is. That evening, after they left for their dinner, I sat in the quiet living room with Mia, asleep in her crib upstairs. I looked around at the perfectly arranged furniture, the art prints bought to impress guests, the designer cushions no one dared use, and I realized I had been living in a museum of pretenses. I thought about the years I spent working at the public library, earning every dollar honestly, teaching children how to read, running bake sales to keep the literacy programs alive. I thought about how Jason once mocked the chipped mugs I kept, the ones that came from that library staff room. They look so municipal, he said, as though that were an insult. I kept them anyway. They were real, unlike him. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back, and listened to the house breathe. It was the sound of someone else's comfort, built on my silence. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped being quiet. I didn't plan revenge, I planned remembrance. I would remember every word, every glance, every instruction to stand out of photos or stay in the kitchen or let the professionals handle it. Because women like me don't need to shout to be heard. We just need proof. When they came home later, Jason smiled like nothing had happened, kissed my daughter's cheek, and nodded at me with the faintest trace of discomfort. I smiled back. I'd already made up my mind. You can't bury a woman you've built your life upon and expect her not to rise from the soil you call dirt. Now, years later, when I think of that night, I don't feel humiliation. I feel gratitude for the moment that split my life into before and after. Before, I was the helper, the background character, the reliable silence. After, I became the witness. And that's the difference between being invisible and being underestimated. One is an accident, the other is an opportunity. Jason thought he was speaking to a man who mattered. He didn't realize the woman in the hallway was listening, and that she would remember every word long enough to make them matter in ways he couldn't imagine. It happened 2 weeks later, on a Thursday, that smelled faintly of rain and reheated. Ambition, The house was unusually quiet, except for the rhythmic clicking of Jason's laptop keys in his office and the occasional cry from Mia's room upstairs. Elise had gone into the city for a client meeting and texted me around noon, reminding me to defrost salmon for dinner and to keep the baby from crawling on the rug in the sitting room because it sheds. I didn't reply. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the marble counter that I had polished every morning as though it could polish me back into worth. The words he had said, lower-class trash, still lived in the walls, soft but constant, like the hum of the refrigerator. I could not stop hearing them in different tones, amused, pitying, definitive. It was the first time in my life I understood that humiliation could echo long after the room empties. When Jason's phone rang, he stepped out of the office, his voice low and self-satisfied. He had that tone he used for clients, full of careful warmth that felt borrowed. I listened without meaning to, just enough to catch phrases. Yes, the bid was approved. No, she's no trouble. Of course, family helps. That's what they're for. And then he laughed softly, that same laugh I had heard on the night of the dinner. Her mother? She's staying with us, yes, helping with the baby. Old school type, simple woman, but kind. My wife takes after me, thank God. I froze, hand tightening around the mug. I wasn't a participant in his life story. I was the supporting anecdote he used to make himself sound noble. I could have stayed seated, could have swallowed it again, as I had swallowed so many smaller indignities. But something in me was shifting, quiet but undeniable. I stood, walked down the hallway, and stopped outside his office door. It was half open, enough to see him leaning back in his leather chair, a picture of controlled confidence. On the wall behind him hung framed degrees and a glossy photo of him shaking hands with a man in a gray suit. That photo had replaced the one of Elise and me on her graduation day. I used to think it was oversight. Now I knew it was design. I knocked once. He looked up, startled. "Oh, hi, Mary," he said, his tone bright but strained, the way people speak to customer service representatives. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I said evenly. "I just came to tell you lunch is ready." He nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face, and I turned to go. I had already decided something, though I couldn't have said what yet. Maybe it was that I was tired of being polite. Maybe it was that I had finally stopped confusing endurance with virtue. That evening, Elise came home late, distracted and hurried. She kissed Jason, thanked him for setting the table, and barely looked at me. During dinner, they discussed an upcoming company retreat, some luxury resort where spouses were optional but encouraged. Elise laughed when he joked that she would stay behind with the baby, and I noticed how her laughter faltered just a fraction of a second too late. I wondered if she'd stopped hearing herself in her own life, if she'd become fluent in denial. After dinner, when I was washing dishes, Jason came into the kitchen. "You don't have to do that," he said, though he made no move to help. "I know," I replied. He leaned against the counter, watching me in that casual, appraising way he had, as if he were inspecting property. "Elise tells me you've been restless lately. Everything all right? We want you to feel comfortable here." The way he said we made my skin crawl. "I'm perfectly fine," I answered. "Good," he said, smiling in a way that meant the conversation was over. "I was just checking in." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the rain tapping against the window, each drop a slow count of the years I had spent being useful. I thought of my husband, of the house we had shared, modest, a little crooked, but ours. I thought of how we used to say, That decency was the only inheritance we could afford to leave behind. I wondered what he would have said if he had heard Jason's voice, or worse, Elise's silence. The clock glowed faintly on the nightstand, 1:43 a.m. I rose quietly, careful not to wake the baby, and went downstairs. The house was dark, except for the faint green light of the security panel. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my purse, and took out the small notebook I had been keeping since I moved in. Inside were grocery lists, medication reminders, notes about the baby's feedings. I turned to a blank page and began to write. Not poetry, not even sentences, just fragments, dates, times, words, his words. I didn't know why I was doing it, only that it felt like reclaiming oxygen. The next morning, Jason left early for work. Elise was still half asleep, hair tousled, eyes hollow. "You look tired," I said gently. She shrugged. "It's just a lot right now. Jason's firm's under pressure, and he's been tense." She said it with the weary loyalty of a woman who has learned that her role is to absorb blame. I wanted to tell her she didn't owe anyone that kind of devotion, but mothers learn which truths will only make daughters defensive. So I just nodded and poured her coffee. "Thanks, Mom," she murmured, and for a fleeting moment I saw the girl she used to be, the one who believed kindness was strength, not weakness. Later that day, while folding laundry in the den, I found an envelope half tucked under a stack of bills on the console table. It was addressed to Jason's firm, but what caught my eye was the return address, my name, my handwriting. Only it wasn't mine. Someone had copied it perfectly. I opened it out of instinct, half afraid, half curious. Inside was a thank you note, apparently from me, written to Jason's senior partner. "Thank you for inviting me to your lovely home. It's an honor to see the world my son-in-law has built. I'm so proud of him." My breath caught. I had never written that note. I had never even met the man. Jason had forged it. My name, my voice, my gratitude, all borrowed to decorate his ascent. I sat down, the letter trembling in my hand, and felt the room tilt slightly. This wasn't just arrogance. It was appropriation. I was no longer merely invisible. I was being repurposed. He had rewritten me into a prop for his reputation. That realization was the crack that let something irreversible through. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back exactly where I had found it. I didn't confront him. I didn't tell Elise. I just knew, with an icy calmness I hadn't felt in years, that the quiet agreement I had been living under was broken. He had borrowed enough of my dignity, and I intended to repossess it. That night, after everyone went to bed, I retrieved the notebook again and added a new entry. April 16th, forgery discovered. My name stolen. Then beneath it, I wrote one sentence I had not planned, one that arrived whole. No one gets to narrate me. The next morning, I began to pay attention in a new way, not to their words, but to their rhythms. Jason's temper disguised as charm, Elise's apologies disguised as love. I moved through their home like a careful observer, noting everything. The way Jason snapped at waitstaff on speakerphone, the way he lowered his voice when I entered a room, the way Elise's shoulders stiffened when he touched her arm too long. I wasn't preparing evidence yet, but I was collecting understanding. The real catalyst came one afternoon when the baby monitor caught a conversation not meant for me. I was in the kitchen stirring soup when I heard their voices upstairs. Elise was crying softly, saying something about how I felt out of place. Jason's reply was low, clipped. "She's lucky to even be here. You know where she comes from. We're doing her a favor." The sound of that sentence, doing her a favor, hit harder than anything else. I turned the stove off, walked to the base of the stairs, and listened to the quiet that followed. The house felt like a theater set after the audience has gone home. Perfect lighting, no heart. I went back to the kitchen, poured the soup into containers, labeled them neatly, and placed them in the refrigerator. Then I took my phone from the counter, opened the voice recorder app, and pressed record. I didn't know why, only that it felt necessary, like bracing before impact. From that moment on, I carried that phone with me everywhere, each conversation a thread I might one day need to pull. I wasn't planning vengeance. I was documenting truth. And truth, once written or recorded, becomes something heavier than memory. It becomes proof. That was the night I stopped being the helper and became the witness. And once a woman like me starts paying attention, the world trembles a little, even if it doesn't know why yet. The first signs of escalation did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors, but with something far quieter, the tightening of space around me, the invisible shrinking of air. Jason didn't confront me, didn't accuse or scold. He simply began to erase me from the corners of his life in the same precise, methodical way a man trims hedges, clipping away anything that grows beyond control. He started by taking over the kitchen, claiming he wanted to experiment with new recipes from the firm's social cookbook. Suddenly, my meals were no longer welcome at the table. Elise laughed when he teased, "Your mother's cooking belongs in another era." But her laughter came too quickly, too defensively, like someone clapping before the performance ends. I sat through those evenings quietly, chewing the food that had no warmth, tasting the careful blandness of self-restraint. Then came the invitations, or rather the uninvitations. They had started hosting again, small gatherings with wine and the kind of laughter that sounds rehearsed. On those nights, Elise would bring me tea upstairs before guests arrived, smiling too brightly as she said, "You must be tired, Mom. Why don't you rest tonight? You know how loud these events get." Rest. That was the word they used when they wanted me silent. Rest meant stay invisible. Rest meant you embarrass us. So I would stay upstairs in the attic room, listening to the sounds of conversation floating up the staircase. The clink of glass, the rise and fall of voices, the familiar cadence of Jason's practiced charm. I began to recognize his pattern, self-deprecating joke, compliment to his host, anecdote designed to sound spontaneous. Once, I heard him tell a guest that Elise came from a humble background, said in a tone of generous amusement, as though it were an anecdote about an antique found in a thrift store. In the mornings, he became formal, stiffly polite. He began calling me Mary, never Mom. When Elise noticed, he said lightly, "It's a sign of respect. She's not just your mother. She's her own person." I could have laughed at the irony if it hadn't hurt so sharply. His kind of respect was like frost. It preserved appearances by killing everything underneath. Elise didn't protest. She was learning the art of appeasement from the best teacher. I saw how she adjusted her tone to match his, how she began curating her own words, shaping them to fit his world. She started saying things like, "We don't use paper towels, Mom," or "It's not polite to talk about money here." The we in her voice was no longer a family. It was a fortress, and I was the trespasser. One afternoon, I came downstairs with Mia in my arms. She was teething and had been fussy all morning, so I walked her around the kitchen, humming softly the lullaby my own mother used to sing. Jason entered mid-song, dressed in a suit smelling of cologne and ambition. He paused, frowned slightly, and said, "Could you keep it down? I'm on a conference call." His voice wasn't angry, just dismissive, but it cut clean through me. I nodded, retreated to the living room, and sat on the floor with Mia. The baby reached up and touched my cheek as if to apologize for the world's indifference. In that moment, I realized that kindness is not inherited. It must be taught, again and again, or it disappears. Days blurred into one another. I began to sense that my usefulness was being phased out. Jason hired a new housekeeper to help with the heavy chores. Elise insisted it was to ease my burden, but the new woman, a quiet girl named Camila, was instructed not to touch Jason's office or the guest room upstairs, which told me more than words ever could. Camilla moved through the house with the caution of someone who has already learned that gratitude is expected but not rewarded. We became silent allies, exchanging glances instead of sentences. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she whispered, "He doesn't like people looking him in the eyes, says it's distracting." I smiled thinly. "Then we'll keep him very comfortable," I said, and she suppressed a laugh before hurrying away. The notebook I kept began to fill faster. At first I had written only facts, dates, words, small gestures. But now I began to record the silences too, the things unsaid that revealed more than speech. April 29th, I wrote. He thanked me for staying out of the way. May 2nd, Elise said, "Don't take it personally." May 5, he looked at me like I was furniture that had stayed too long. Writing became my act of defiance, my small rebellion against erasure. Each entry was a reminder that I was still present, still naming what they refused to see. Then, one morning, I found my belongings rearranged. My books had been moved from the living room shelf to a cardboard box labeled Mom's Things. My sewing kit was gone from the kitchen drawer. When I asked Elise, she said gently, "Jason thought it would help organize the space better. You know how he likes order." I nodded, but inside I felt the cold certainty of exile. This was how people are removed, quietly, under the pretense of tidiness. When order becomes a virtue, love turns into clutter. The real fracture came a week later. Jason had invited colleagues for a barbecue, a casual outdoor event meant to showcase his down-to-earth side. I had prepared potato salad and cornbread early in the morning, setting them on the counter with pride. When I returned from putting Mia down for her nap, the dishes were gone. Elise was standing by the patio door, nervous. "Jason ordered catering," she said quickly. "He thought it would be simpler. The presentation's nicer." She said it like a justification, not an apology. Through the glass, I could see trays of food arriving, uniform, glossy, soulless. I looked at the spot where my cornbread had been. The counter was spotless. "Where did it go?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. He thought maybe the kitchen could look less cluttered. The words landed softly, but I felt them in my bones. My food, my labor, my small attempt at belonging had been thrown away because it didn't fit the aesthetic. That was the day I stopped cooking in their house. After the guests arrived, I stayed indoors, watching from the window as Jason laughed under string lights, flipping burgers he hadn't seasoned, gesturing with confidence toward the house as if it were an extension of himself. I could hear snippets of his conversation, the practiced humility in his voice as he said things like, "We've worked hard for this, but we stay grounded," and "Elise's mom's here for a bit. She's a real sweetheart, salt of the earth." Salt of the earth. The phrase sounded generous until I realized it was just another way to say dirt. Elise came in later to check on me, her face flushed, eyes darting nervously. "They asked about you," she said. "I told them you weren't feeling well." I smiled faintly. "That's kind of you." She bit her lip. "Jason just thinks it's easier this way. You know how these things are." I did. I knew exactly how these things were. The world is full of women like her, trying to negotiate between love and complicity, not realizing that silence always sides with power. The next morning, I found the cornbread dish in the outside trash, unbroken but smeared with uneaten crumbs. I took it out, washed it carefully, and placed it back in the cupboard. I wanted it clean again, not for them, but for me. Each motion, washing, drying, placing, felt ceremonial, like reclaiming something sacred. I didn't cry. The era of tears had passed. What replaced them was focus, cool and deliberate. I started paying attention to the mail that arrived, to the calls Jason made on speakerphone, to the names he dropped into conversations. I learned the names of his partners, his clients, the company that managed their PR. I didn't know yet what I would do with that knowledge, but I knew knowledge itself was power, and I had been powerless long enough. At night, I began listening to the recordings on my phone. I would put in the earphones and let the voices fill the small attic room. Hearing them again was like pressing on a bruise, painful, but proof that it was real. Jason's voice, calm, confident, condescending, repeating phrases that stripped me down to caricature. I listened, not to punish myself, but to remember why I couldn't go back to pretending. And somewhere between those recordings and the quiet scribbles in my notebook, a plan began to take shape. Not fully formed, not yet revenge, but the outline of a reckoning. When I looked in the mirror one morning, I hardly recognized myself. My posture had changed. My eyes were clear. The woman staring back wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She was waiting for timing. I didn't hate Jason. Hatred would have been too simple. What I felt was something colder, more controlled, the kind of calm you see before a storm that has already chosen its target. The days grew longer, the house more suffocating. Every interaction was coated in politeness, so thick it could choke you. Jason had begun greeting me with a professional smile, the kind reserved for clients or distant relatives. Elise tried to bridge the widening gap with small gestures, a cup of tea left outside my door, a folded sweater, but her kindness felt like an apology for the life she refused to defend. I began to realize that I would have to leave eventually, but not before making sure my absence would speak louder than their presence ever had. I continued to collect, to observe, to note. Every false compliment, every polished cruelty, every line of pretended generosity went into the record. And when the time came, and I knew it would make sure that Jason's words, once meant to humiliate me in private, would echo in a place where his own voice couldn't drown them out. That knowledge was my quiet companion, my secret heartbeat, and it was growing stronger every day. The shift began without fanfare, the way most transformations do, not as a loud revelation, but as a slow rearranging of what the heart can no longer ignore. I remember the morning it started clearly, not because of what happened, but because of how ordinary it looked. The light came in through the kitchen window at an angle that made the dust visible, tiny floating particles that looked almost deliberate, as if the air itself had been waiting for me to notice it. Elise had gone to the office early, and Jason was in his study with the door closed, talking in that low, measured tone that he used when he wanted to sound important, but not emotional. I had just finished feeding Mia and was washing her bottles when I saw my reflection in the glass above the sink. Not my face exactly, but a kind of outline, faint, familiar, half-present. I realized I hadn't truly seen myself in months. The woman staring back looked like someone who had lived politely for too long. My shoulders were drawn inward, my mouth soft in the way of people who apologize before they speak. That moment of clarity was neither sad nor angry. It was a recognition that invisibility, once chosen by others, can become a habit if you let it. Later that day, While Jason left for work, I opened the small box of mail that arrived for the household each morning. Normally, I just sorted it by pile, his, hers, bills, coupons, but this time something caught my attention. An envelope addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Jason Weller, embossed in silver, with the logo of his firm in the corner. It was an invitation to the annual corporate gala, the same event he'd once boasted about at dinner, saying it was where reputations were made. Out of curiosity, I opened the firm's website on my phone, scrolling through the team page until I found his photo. There he was, jaw set, expression serious, captioned with the words, "Partner, Client Relations." Beneath it was a short biography Jason had likely written himself. It described his upbringing as rooted in modest beginnings, a phrase that was meant to sound humble but not poor. What struck me, though, was the closing line. He credits his late grandmother's discipline and his wife's unwavering support for shaping his success. Not a word about me. Not a single acknowledgement that the down payment on the house he flaunted had come from my savings. Even my existence had been curated out of his story, like a typo edited before publication. That evening, when Elise came home, I showed her the invitation, half expecting her to mention it casually, to say perhaps that I might help with preparations or the baby while they attended. Instead, she smiled thinly and said, "Jason thought we might skip this year, but I suppose we'll see." The way she said it was too careful, as if rehearsed. Later, I overheard them talking in their bedroom. "It's not personal," Jason was saying. "It's just optics. She doesn't fit the image." And Elise, weary, responding softly, "She's my mother, Jason." His answer came without hesitation. "Then remind her to act like it privately." That night, I sat on my bed with my notebook open and the voice recorder. Resting beside me, I had enough fragments to tell a story. His tone, his arrogance, the disdain threaded through his words like a fine poison. But I didn't yet know what to do with them. I wasn't thinking of exposure then, not exactly. I was thinking about justice, the small kind that restores balance rather than destroys. The next morning, I packed Mia's diaper bag, tied a scarf around my neck, and took her out for a walk. Elise thought I was going to the park, but instead, I stopped at a small cafe 2 blocks away, the kind that sold burnt coffee and sincerity. I sat at a corner table with the stroller beside me and called an old number I hadn't dialed in years. The voice that answered was familiar in the way of past lives, measured, amused, a little surprised. "Mary Cross," he said. "I'll be damned. It's been decades." His name was David Green. He had been a junior HR manager at the same firm where I used to volunteer in their literacy program before I retired. I explained quickly, carefully, that I needed to speak with someone discreetly about a matter involving one of the firm's partners. I told him there had been unprofessional remarks, which was true enough. I didn't use words like insult or classism. Those sounded emotional, and emotion was never taken seriously by men like Jason. David listened quietly, then asked if I could send what I had. His tone changed slightly when I mentioned the recording. "It's sensitive," he said, "but if it's clear and relevant, it can't be ignored." That was all I needed to hear. When I returned home, the house felt different, not colder, calmer, almost anticipatory, as though it too sensed the balance about to shift. Jason was in the kitchen when I came in, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression smooth. He nodded at me absently and continued talking about liabilities and public image. I smiled politely, the way a woman smiles when she knows more than she lets on. Later, when he went upstairs, I transferred the file from my phone to my computer, renamed it simply Conversation 1, and saved a backup to a small USB drive I kept hidden in the lining of my handbag. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsible, like someone preparing evidence for a truth that had been denied too long. The next morning, Jason left for a business trip, just 2 days, a networking event, he said. Elise seemed lighter in his absence. We made breakfast together for the first time in months, pancakes and coffee. Nothing fancy, but full of an ease that used to exist between us. She laughed softly when Mia smeared syrup across her face, and for a fleeting second, I saw the daughter I'd once known, unguarded and kind. But even in that warmth, I sensed her distance, like sunlight that never quite reaches the floor. When I mentioned the recording, not its content, just that I had been keeping notes about the way he spoke to people, her laughter stilled. "Mom, you have to be careful," she said, her voice tightening. "Jason's he doesn't like feeling challenged." I looked at her then, really looked, and realized she was afraid of him, though she would never say it aloud. The revelation didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how calmly I accepted it. That evening, after she went to bed, I sent the audio file to David's work email, along with a short message, "For your review. No further explanation needed." I didn't sign it. The next morning, I received a reply that was only 4 words long. Received, under internal assessment. That was enough. I made myself tea, sat by the window, and watched the day begin. The tension I'd carried for months started to dissolve, not entirely, but enough to breathe. I had done something irreversible, and it didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like truth, finally speaking its own language. When Jason returned 2 days later, he looked different. His confidence had a crack in it, subtle but visible, like a flaw in glass that catches the light. He was quieter at dinner, more measured, and Elise noticed too. "Everything okay?" she asked, and he smiled that thin, false smile. "Of course," he said, "just busy." But I saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his fork hovered above his plate. He excused himself early, claiming fatigue, and I heard him pacing in his office long after the lights went out. I didn't need to check my email to know the firm had acted faster than I'd imagined. Men like Jason live on image. Once the image trembles, the man collapses. In the days that followed, small changes began to surface. His phone rang less often. The firm car stopped appearing in the driveway. I overheard him arguing in low tones, saying things like unsubstantiated, taken out of context, personal vendetta. Elise tried to soothe him, but her attempts only made him colder. The house began to vibrate with tension, as though the walls themselves were absorbing his frustration. And through it all, I remained quiet, deliberate, almost invisible, but no longer powerless. I started walking more, taking longer routes through the neighborhood, not because I needed air, but because I needed distance from their unraveling. On one of those walks, I passed a bookstore with a sign in the window, "Part-time help wanted." The idea struck me suddenly, absurdly, like a spark in dry wood. I went inside, filled out an application, and left without expectation. A week later, they called. 2 mornings a week, sorting inventory and arranging shelves. It wasn't about money. It was about motion, about reclaiming the rhythm of usefulness that wasn't servitude. On my first day, the owner, a woman my age named Ruth, asked if I'd worked in books before. I told her I'd spent 30 years helping children fall in love with reading. She smiled and said, "Then you'll fit right in." When I came home that afternoon, Elise was in the kitchen alone. Jason had gone out, she said, to clear his head. She looked tired, but there was something new in her expression too. Something like resignation dressed as relief. She told me that Jason's firm had temporarily suspended him pending review. I didn't pretend surprise. I only asked if she was all right. She nodded slowly. "Maybe it's for the best," she whispered, and for the first time in years, her voice didn't sound like it belonged to him. That night, after Mia was asleep, I wrote in my notebook one simple line. I acted. I did not apologize. And as I put down the pen, I realized the shift was complete. I was no longer documenting the cruelty of others. I was narrating my own awakening. The power had changed hands, not through anger, not through shouting, but through the quiet precision of truth. And once truth begins to move, it never stops. It would have been easier if the fallout had come all at once, loud and final, but life rarely offers the satisfaction of neat collapses. The ruin came in small, deliberate pieces, like wallpaper peeling one corner at a time, revealing what had always been rotting underneath. For days after Jason's suspension, the house became a theater of strained civility. Elise moved through rooms as though afraid to disturb the air, tidying what was already spotless, lowering her voice until even silence seemed loud. Jason worked from home, which meant pacing, muttering, calling colleagues who no longer returned his calls, slamming drawers under the pretense of looking for files. I could hear the constant hum of his frustration from my room, a noise that reminded me of a trapped animal circling its cage. He didn't speak to me directly, but I could feel his awareness like heat on the back of my neck whenever I passed by him. There is a particular kind of hostility that pretends to be politeness, and he wore it like a second skin. One evening, I came downstairs to find Elise sitting at the dining table, a stack of unopened envelopes before her. She looked smaller than usual, her posture folding inward. Jason stood by the window with a drink in his hand, his tie loosened, his jaw set in that fixed expression of performative calm. The firm's conducting a full review, he said to no one in particular. They said it's procedural, standard protocol. Elise nodded faintly, as if afraid that even agreement might set him off. Then he added, with a deliberate glance in my direction, apparently someone took an interest in twisting my words. The air thickened between us. I poured myself a glass of water, steady and unhurried. Some words twist themselves, I said softly, and his head snapped toward me like a whip. For a brief moment, the veneer cracked. Something sharp flashed in his eyes before he smoothed it over with a smile that didn't reach his mouth. "Careful, Mary," he said quietly. "You wouldn't want people to think you're meddling in things you don't understand." "You're right," I replied. "I understand more than I ever wanted to." Then I took my glass upstairs without looking back. That night, I lay awake listening to the sound of their muffled argument. Elise's voice rose and fell, trembling with fear and frustration. Jason stayed low, controlled, weaponized calm. I caught fragments: embarrassment, rumors, loyalty, my career, and then a pause, long, heavy, before Elise said, in a voice that cracked open something inside me, "She's my mother, Jason. You can't keep talking about her like she's some problem to be managed." His answer was too quiet to make out, but the tone was final, the kind of tone that leaves no room for appeal. The next morning, Elise's eyes were swollen, and Jason didn't come down for breakfast. Over the next week, subtle punishments began to take shape. Small, almost imperceptible acts meant to remind me of my supposed place. My car keys went missing for a day, then reappeared on the kitchen counter as though nothing had happened. The thermostat in my room mysteriously broke, leaving the air stuffy and stifling. One afternoon, I found that my notebook had been moved from its drawer. Nothing was missing, but I knew it had been read. The page marker shifted, a corner folded back. Jason never mentioned it, and I didn't either, but from then on I wrote in code, small symbols only I understood. Each line became a vow, each symbol a shield. Elise tried to bridge the widening distance, but her gestures grew increasingly fragile. She invited me for tea one afternoon, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "He's under pressure," she said, her voice a pleading whisper. "You know how men can be when they feel powerless." I wanted to tell her that cruelty was never about power lost, but about control maintained, but I stopped myself. She wasn't ready to hear that yet. Instead, I asked her if she was afraid. She blinked rapidly, looking at the window instead of me. "No," she said too quickly. Then, after a pause, "I just want things to go back to normal." Normal. The word hung in the air like the smell of something burning that no one wants to acknowledge. The real turn came one afternoon when a courier arrived at the door with a thick manila envelope addressed to Jason. He wasn't home, so Elise signed for it and left it on the counter. When he returned, his face tightened at the sight of it. He took it upstairs without a word. That evening, while washing dishes, I heard his voice echo through the floorboards above, sharp and venomous. "Anonymous source," he spat. "Recordings, documentation, allegations of misconduct." Then silence, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the wall. Elise ran upstairs, and for a moment I considered following, but I didn't. I stayed by the sink, hands submerged in soapy water, watching the bubbles dissolve. Sometimes self-control feels like cowardice, but it's the only thing that keeps dignity intact. After that night, Jason began treating me as if I were radioactive. He wouldn't speak to me directly, wouldn't meet my eyes, but I could sense his paranoia growing. He installed new locks on his office door and carried his phone everywhere, even into the shower. He told Elise I was confused, that I'd been imagining slights. I overheard him telling his mother on the phone that Mary's losing her mind, probably early dementia. The ease with which he rewrote reality was almost impressive. I had spent years of my life believing that silence was virtue, but now I saw it for what it was, a blank page on which others can write whatever suits them. One afternoon, while Elise was out and Jason was in his office, I heard his phone ring. The ringtone was muted but distinct, a low buzzing. It stopped, then started again. On the third ring, curiosity overcame restraint. I walked past his office and saw the door slightly ajar. On the desk, the phone screen was lit, displaying a name I recognized from the firm's website, one of the senior partners. The preview of the message read, "Meeting rescheduled. Please bring all statements." My heart quickened. Statements. I knew what that meant. Whatever investigation had begun was moving forward. Jason was cornered, and men like him don't go down gracefully. That evening, I sat in my room and made copies of everything, audio files, scanned notebook pages, photographs of the letter he'd forged with my handwriting. I stored them on 2 separate USB drives, hiding one in the lining of my old handbag, the other inside the hollow base of a lamp that hadn't worked in years. It wasn't fear driving me now. It was foresight. I knew Jason well enough to recognize the shape of desperation when I saw it. He was losing the only thing he valued, his image, and a man who defines himself by control will destroy anything that reminds him of his failure. The next morning, Elise knocked softly on my door. Her face was pale, her eyes red. "He's saying someone set him up," she whispered, "that the recordings were edited." I looked at her for a long time. "Do you believe him?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she sank into the chair by my bed and covered her face with her hands. I don't know what's true anymore, she murmured. I wanted to hold her, but I also wanted to shake her, to make her see that confusion was exactly what men like Jason relied on. You know what's true, I said quietly. You've always known. The following week brought more cracks. Jason's name was quietly removed from the firm's website. The neighbors, who had once greeted him with deferential smiles, now waved with a hint of curiosity, the kind reserved for people whose downfall makes good gossip. Packages stopped arriving. The once spotless lawn began to grow wild around the edges. Elise started spending more time at her sister's house. I could feel the house exhale, the tension leaking out through its seams. Jason stayed mostly in his office, door closed, blinds drawn. One night, near midnight, I heard footsteps outside my room. They paused at my door, lingered. I lay still, breath held. The doorknob turned slightly, then stopped. A long silence followed, broken only by the faint sound of his breathing. Then the footsteps retreated down the hall. I waited until morning before unlocking the door. I found a single sheet of paper on the floor, slid under the crack. In Jason's handwriting, jagged and rushed, it read, I know it was you. I folded it neatly, placed it inside my notebook, and wrote beneath it, yes, it was. That morning, Elise announced she was taking Mia to her sister's for a few days. Jason didn't argue. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. When the car pulled out of the driveway, I stood at the kitchen window, watching the taillights fade. The house was finally quiet. Jason came downstairs an hour later, poured himself a drink, and leaned against the counter. You must feel proud, he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. You've ruined everything. I didn't respond. Do you think they care about you at that firm? You're a nobody. You always were. He took a slow sip, eyes fixed on me. I should have listened to Elise. Bringing you here was a mistake. I turned to face him fully, my voice steady. No, Jason. The mistake was believing that your lies would never echo. He laughed then, a low, bitter sound. You think you've won? You've just made enemies you can't even see. I stepped closer, my gaze unflinching. I've spent 74 years being unseen. It doesn't scare me anymore. For the first time, he had no reply. He walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. That afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. 2 men in suits stepped out, one carrying a briefcase. Through the kitchen window, I saw Jason greet them at the door, his composure brittle but intact. They went into his office, and for hours I heard nothing but muffled voices. When they finally left, Jason didn't emerge. Later, I saw him standing in the yard, staring at the hedge, motionless. I didn't feel triumph. I felt release, the kind of quiet that follows the end of a long, cruel season. That night, Elise called. He's leaving tomorrow, she said, her voice flat. The firm asked him to resign quietly. He'll stay with his mother for a while. There was a pause. Then, he blames you. I took a deep breath. Let him, I said. Truth always needs a villain. When morning came, Jason's car was gone. The house felt lighter, almost hollow. Elise returned 2 days later, pale but resolute. She said little, only that she'd decided to sell the house. I didn't argue. I packed my things slowly, folding each item as if sealing a chapter. Before leaving, I walked into Jason's empty office. The walls were bare, the shelves stripped. On the desk, I placed the folded note he had slipped under my door. But on the back, I wrote one sentence in neat, deliberate script. I know it was me too. Then I left, closing the door behind me with the soft certainty of someone who no longer needed to explain herself. As I drove away, the house receded in the rearview mirror, small and distant, like a memory that had finally learned its place. The road ahead stretched long and open, the air cool and forgiving. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was walking toward myself. The day I decided to act, the air felt unnaturally still, as if the world had paused to see whether I would follow through with what I already knew was inevitable. By then, weeks had passed since Jason's departure, and Elise was living in a kind of stunned silence, moving through her days as if she were afraid sound itself might shatter the fragile surface of her new life. We had sold the house. She had taken an apartment near the edge of the city, where the rooms were smaller, but the air was breathable. I rented my own place nearby, a modest one-bedroom above a small bakery, whose owner left the scent of bread in the hallways each morning. On the surface, it looked like we were both rebuilding, but beneath the quiet routines, something unresolved was still breathing. The story wasn't finished, because I hadn't finished it. One morning, as I was sorting through a box of old papers, I found the USB drive I had hidden months earlier, the one with all the recordings and notes, the whole raw record of what had been said and done. I had almost forgotten it existed. Holding it between my fingers, I felt its small weight, insignificant and absolute at once. The firm had handled its business quietly, of course. Jason had been allowed to resign with a vague statement about personal matters. His reputation, though bruised, had not been destroyed. The truth had been contained, filed away, managed. That was their specialty, damage control disguised as dignity. I told myself that what I had done was enough, that justice didn't always need to humiliate to be real. But as I listened to the news one evening and heard a segment about Jason's new consulting firm opening downtown, the calm I'd been cultivating cracked like thin glass. He was back, rebranded, clean. He had rebuilt himself on the same foundation of deceit, using silence as cement. I sat there in the dim light of my living room, the sound of the television fading into a dull hum, and I realized I wasn't finished at all. It wasn't revenge I wanted, not anymore. It was revelation. I wanted the world to see what it looked like when cruelty wore a good suit and a charming smile. I wanted the same words he had used to shrink me, to call me trash, to erase me, to follow him into the rooms where he thought he was untouchable. So I did what I had been trained my entire life to do. I worked carefully, precisely, without fanfare. The first thing I did was find a contact at the local newspaper. Not one of those glossy publications that run puff pieces about charity galas, but a community journalist who wrote stories about people whose names didn't appear on plaques. Her name was Leah. I met her once at the Literacy Center, where I volunteered. She had listened then, really listened, when others only nodded politely. I found her email, attached the recordings, and wrote, "This is what a man says when he thinks no one who matters is listening." Then I added, "He works with clients who should know." I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require authorship. For 2 days, nothing happened. I went about my routine as if the decision were a small one, something domestic and forgettable. I taught my classes, shopped for groceries, watered my plants. Then one morning the phone began to ring. It wasn't Leah, it was Elise. Her voice was trembling. "Mom," she said, "it's everywhere. They published the recording. It's in the paper. Jason's name, his words, everything." She was crying, not just from shock, but from the weight of realization. I heard her inhale sharply, then whisper, "Did you do this?" I hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I did." The line went quiet. I imagined her hand pressed to her mouth, her mind racing through all the years she'd tried to hold things together, to protect him, to maintain the image. "They're calling him a hypocrite," she said finally. "His clients are pulling out." I closed my eyes. Then they're seeing him clearly for the first time. The story spread quickly, faster than I expected. It wasn't scandalous enough for television, but it found its audience online, where indignation travels faster than truth. The article quoted his words exactly. Every syllable of arrogance, every condescending laugh. "Lower-class trash," he had said. And now that phrase appeared in bold letters, repeated in comment sections, dissected in think pieces about class and respectability. The irony was unbearable and exquisite. The man who had built his image on refinement undone by his own voice. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Elise came to see me the next day. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept. "He's furious," she said, sitting down across from me. "He says he'll find out who leaked it." I poured her tea, watching the steam rise between us. "He already knows," I said. She didn't answer. Instead, she asked the question I had been waiting for. "Why, Mom? Why couldn't you just let it go?" I smiled sadly. Because letting it go would have meant accepting the story he wrote for us. I was tired of being a footnote in a lie. Elise looked down, tears gathering in her eyes. He's saying I betrayed him too, that I was part of it. I reached across the table, took her hand. "You don't have to defend him anymore. You don't owe him your silence." She didn't pull away. She just sat there, her fingers trembling in mine, and for the first time, I saw the beginning of something that looked like freedom in her face. The following week was chaos for Jason. The firm that had discreetly dismissed him now issued a formal statement condemning his remarks. Clients severed contracts. Invitations disappeared. Even the people who once flattered him began to distance themselves, rewriting their own roles in his story. I watched it unfold, not with glee, but with the detached awe of someone witnessing gravity do what it always does. When you spend your life building on false ground, collapse is not tragedy, it's consequence. Still, part of me waited for some kind of confrontation, a moment when he would appear, demanding an explanation, wanting to reclaim control of the narrative. That moment came sooner than I expected. It was a gray afternoon, the kind that feels like the sky is undecided. I had just returned from the center when I saw him standing outside my building. He looked smaller than I remembered, though he was still immaculately dressed. His eyes, however, were restless, darting between anger and disbelief. "You did this," he said as soon as I stepped closer. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. "You think you've won?" he continued. "You've destroyed my life." I studied him for a moment before replying, "No, Jason, you destroyed your life the moment you decided other people didn't count." His mouth twisted. "You think anyone cares about your moral lecture? You're nobody." "And yet," I said quietly, "the whole city heard my recording." That stopped him. He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "You ruined Elise's life, too," he said finally. "She'll never recover from this." I shook my head slowly. "You're wrong. She's already recovering. You're the one who never will." He took a step closer, his voice low. "You don't know what I'm capable of." I met his gaze evenly. "I do." That's why I made sure everything was sent to more than one place. For the first time, I saw fear flicker behind his composure. He realized then that he had no leverage left, no version of the story he could control. He turned abruptly and walked away, his shoulders rigid, his pride collapsing inward like paper burned from the edges. I watched him disappear into the blur of traffic, a man still trying to outrun his own echo. When I went back upstairs, I sat by the window and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. The city below was noisy, alive, indifferent. I thought about how many women carry stories like mine, quiet humiliations endured in houses built on someone else's rules, their dignity buried beneath civility. I had carried mine for too long, but now it was no longer a secret. It was history, public and unerasable. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. That evening, Elise called again. Her voice was steadier this time. "He's gone," she said. "He moved out of the city. No one knows where." There was relief in her tone, but also a grief that only comes from acknowledging what was never going to be healed. "What about you?" I asked. She hesitated. "I think I'll be okay." Then, more softly, "I think you were right. About silence. It's heavy," I said, "but you can put it down when you're ready." After we hung up, I opened my window. The smell of the bakery rose from below. Yeast, sugar, something warm and human. I took the last copy of the recording, the one still on my laptop, and dragged it into the trash. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed delete. Not because I regretted it, but because I was done with it. I had used my voice. I didn't need to keep its evidence anymore. The power had already done its work. As night fell, I sat in the quiet glow of my small apartment and thought about the strange symmetry of it all. The man who once called me trash had been undone by the words he spoke into the air, words that came back to him like shards of a mirror he'd tried to break. And I, the woman he dismissed as invisible, had become the reflection he could no longer escape. That is what justice looks like sometimes. Not revenge, not triumph, but truth finding its way home. I made myself tea and stood by the window, watching the lights flicker across the street. Somewhere below, the bakery owner was closing up shop, locking the door, humming to herself. I smiled faintly. Life was small again, but it was mine, intact, unborrowed. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was simply living, and that was enough. There is a kind of peace that doesn't arrive with joy, but with the soft exhaustion that follows a long storm. That is the kind I live in now. My days are smaller, but not lonely. I rise early before the street below wakes and brew my coffee while the bakery ovens start their slow hum. The smell of bread mixes with the faint chill that seeps through the old window panes, and sometimes when the first light spills across the floor, I stand there just to feel it warm my hands. My body is slower, yes, but it is still mine, obedient to no one. That, to me, is luxury, the right to move without permission, to exist without apology. I teach at the Literacy Center 3 afternoons a week. The women who come there are like different versions of the same story. Caregivers, widows, immigrants, quiet survivors of invisible battles. We don't speak much about the past. It shows itself in our posture, our silences, the way our voices tremble when reading aloud. Sometimes, when one of them stumbles over a sentence and laughs in embarrassment, I tell her what I've learned too late, that dignity doesn't live in perfect grammar, it lives in persistence. Elise visits with Mia on Sundays. The child has grown tall, her laughter brighter than I remember laughter ever being in that old house. She calls me Grandma, with the absolute ease of someone who doesn't know that there was ever a time when that word carried tension. When she runs into my arms, I feel the circle close, the line of women in our family stitching itself whole again. Elise has changed too. There's a softness to her now, but also a strength that used to frighten her. She works part-time at a community legal office, helping women navigate divorces, custody battles, financial independence. When I ask if the work is heavy, she smiles faintly and says, "Not compared to what I used to carry." Sometimes over tea, we talk about Jason. Not often, and not cruelly. He has become like an old photograph, flat, distant, unable to touch us anymore. The last I heard, he'd moved abroad, taken some consulting role under another name. I don't wish him harm. I only hope he looks at his reflection sometimes and hears the echo of his own words. That is punishment enough. In the evenings, when the city quiets, I write letters I never send. Some are to my husband, telling him that our daughter is safe, that our granddaughter is whole, that the small inheritance he left, the one Jason once dismissed as trivial, bought freedom in a way he could never have imagined. Some are to myself, to the woman I used to be, the one who mistook silence for peace. I tell her I forgive her. She did what she had to do to survive. But survival is not the same as living, and it took me too long to learn the difference. And sometimes, when I am braver, I write to women I've never met. Strangers who might be sitting in rooms they don't feel welcome in. Married to men who mistake politeness for goodness. Mothers whose children have learned to look through them. I tell them that it isn't too late to speak. The world won't end when you do. It will begin. I've kept one object from that old house, the cornbread dish, the one Jason threw away before his barbecue. It sits on my shelf now, a little chipped, gleaming faintly in the light. I use it whenever I bake, not because I need it, but because it reminds me of a truth too simple for words, that what others discard can still hold warmth. Once when Mia saw it and asked why it looked a little broken, I told her, because it's been loved for a long time. She nodded with the grave seriousness only children have and said, "Then it's perfect." I laughed, but later, as I washed it by hand, I realized she was right. Imperfection is its own proof of endurance. Sometimes I pass the old neighborhood when I take the bus to the library. The house looks different now. Someone else owns it. The hedges are taller, the paint a little too bright. I don't linger. I simply look once, acknowledge it like an old wound that has healed without leaving a scar, and move on. The past doesn't call to me anymore. It watches quietly, and I nod in return. The people at the Literacy Center call me Miss Mary, though some of the younger volunteers joke and say, "Professor." It makes me smile because once upon a time, I was only ever called Mom, Mother-in-law, Help, or, at worst, Trash. Names change. That's one of the few blessings of survival. You get to rename yourself as many times as it takes to sound like truth. Every so often, a woman stays behind after class and asks how I learned to speak so calmly about things that must have hurt so much. I tell her calm doesn't come first. It comes after the fire burns long enough to clear the field. You don't rush peace, you build it out of ash. They usually nod, though sometimes they cry, and I let them. Crying is its own literacy. It teaches the body how to read itself again. As I write these last words tonight, the city hums beyond my window, full of strangers returning home to places that might or might not hold them kindly. I think about all the houses that contain quiet wars, all the women standing at kitchen sinks rehearsing apologies that don't belong to them. I wish I could tell each of them what I've come to understand. That invisibility isn't death. It's a pause, a waiting place where courage gathers itself. You can live invisible for years, decades even, and still wake one morning to find your voice unbroken, waiting exactly where you left it. I did. The world didn't change when I spoke. The sky didn't open. The wrongs weren't erased. But I changed. My voice entered rooms it had once been forbidden from. And even if no one remembers the details, I do. That's enough. The story doesn't need applause. It only needs truth to keep breathing. So if any woman ever hears this, someone sitting in a darkened room after being told she is less, that her life is a debt, that her worth is conditional, this is what I want her to know. Take notes. Remember everything. Keep proof not because you plan revenge, but because the act of recording is already resistance. Someday, you'll set it down the way I did, and you'll realize the story no longer owns you. It becomes lighter. You become real again. I end my days quietly now. I read until sleep comes, and in the final stillness before dreams, I think of all the voices that have been reclaimed, all the women who walked out of the rooms that belittled them. There's a kind of music in that silence, low and steady, like the hum of a house finally at peace. And I realize that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about no longer needing to be remembered by those who never saw you in the first place. I no longer wait for acknowledgement. I've already given it to myself. That, I suppose, is how freedom sounds at 74, unapologetically quiet, steady as breath, alive as truth.